Brookhaven looked like the kind of town where nothing ever really happened. White picket fences, American flags fluttering lazily on porches, and a main street lined with mom and pop diners that smelled like fresh coffee and old nostalgia. It was the kind of place where people waved at their neighbors, kids rode their bikes until sunset, and the biggest scandal in town was who won the county fair's pie baking contest. But if you knew where to look, if you really paid attention, you'd see the cracks beneath the surface. It was a late afternoon in July, and the heat pressed down on the pavement like an iron fist. The air smelled of cut grass, sizzling burgers from a diner down the block, and the faintest trace of summer rain lingering in the distance. Sister Abigail Monroe, a woman who had spent the last 40 years serving the needy, adjusted the weight of her grocery bags as she made her way back to the shelter. The plastic handles dug into her fingers, but she didn't mind. Inside the bags were just the basics: bread, milk, canned goods. Just enough to keep the shelter stocked for another couple of days. She had walked this route hundreds of times before, past the rusting gas station, the pawn shop with the flickering neon, "We Buy Gold" sign, the shaded bus stop where people waited more for hope than for transportation. But today was different. Up ahead, a boy stood stiffly near an ATM, his frame too thin for a 15-year-old, his sneakers scuffed, his oversized t-shirt hanging loose on his small frame. His hands trembled as he fished through his pockets, frustration flickering across his face. Jason Miller. Abigail had worked with kids long enough to recognize that look: hunger, worry, and just a touch of shame. She didn't hesitate. "Are you all right, son?" Her voice was steady, warm. Jason flinched at first, his eyes wide with something that wasn't just surprise, fear. "Maybe." He hesitated before exhaling sharply. I don't have enough. I need $10 more. It's for my insulin." Abigail felt a pang in her chest. She didn't need to ask more. She had seen too many families struggle, too many lives hanging in the balance over something that should have been a basic human right. Without a word, she reached into her pocket and pressed a crumpled $10 bill into his palm. "Here. Get what you need." For a moment, Jason just stared at the money, as if he was afraid it would disappear. Then, with a rushed thank you, he bolted toward the pharmacy. Abigail smiled to herself. A small act of kindness, a tiny ripple in a world that often felt too cruel. But before she could take another step, a shadow fell over her. A voice, flat and authoritative, cut through the thick summer air. "What's going on here?" She turned, and there he was, Officer Travis Boone. His feet were planted wide, his thumbs hooked into his duty belt. Everything about him screamed authority: the squared shoulders, the buzz cut, the mirrored sunglasses that hid whatever flicker of thought might be running through his head. A walking stereotype of small-town law enforcement. Abigail knew his type before he even opened his mouth. She kept her voice level. "I was just helping that boy. He needed a few dollars for his medication." Boone tilted his head slightly, considering, then smirked like he had just caught her in a lie. "Are you sure he wasn't just hustling you? You know how these kids are." Abigail felt something cold settle in her chest. She knew, right then and there, that this was about to turn into something much bigger than a $10 bill. For a moment, everything stood still. The world around them, the humming of cars, the distant chatter from the diner patio, the rhythmic clinking of a flagpole caught in the wind, seemed to fade into the background. Officer Travis Boone stood in front of Sister Abigail Monroe, his presence alone demanding authority, his mirrored sunglasses concealing whatever thoughts lurked behind them. Abigail had encountered men like him before. Men who carried their badges like shields, mistaking fear for respect, believing their authority was absolute. She had spent decades helping those discarded by people like him, the lost, the forgotten, the ones the system had failed. She had seen this type of arrogance before, and she knew exactly where it led. But she wasn't afraid. She met his stare evenly. "That boy needed his medication, officer. He wasn't hustling anyone." Boone's smirk deepened, his stance shifting slightly. He exhaled sharply, as if she had just said something profoundly naive. "Lady, I've been doing this job a long time. I know exactly how this goes. Some kid comes up with a sob story, good-hearted folks like you fall for it, and next thing you know, they're using that cash for their next fix." A spark of anger flickered in Abigail's chest, but she kept her voice measured. "And what if he's telling the truth?" Boone let out a low chuckle. It's my job to assume the worst. Keeps the streets clean. Something in his tone made the air feel heavier, like a storm waiting to break. People had started to notice. A couple standing near the ATM had paused their conversation, their gazes flicking between Abigail and Boone. A man on a bicycle slowed down, lingering a little too long before pedaling away. And then there were the phones. Abigail could see them, hands slipping into pockets, fingers unlocking screens, cameras being raised. Boone noticed too. His smirk vanished. His fingers flexed against his belt. The moment was slipping out of his control, and he didn't like that. Drop the bags. Hands behind your head. Abigail blinked. Excuse me? Boone cocked his head slightly. You heard me. She felt the weight of the moment settle in her chest. Around them, conversations had died mid-sentence. A few folks reached for their phones, and she knew this wasn't the kind of thing people ignored anymore. What exactly am I being accused of, officer? She asked, keeping her voice calm even as heat prickled up her spine. Boone squared his shoulders. His voice was clipped, firm. Non-compliance. The word hung in the air like a threat. Abigail let out a slow breath. She had seen this play out before, maybe not to her, but to others. She had spent years working with those who had been crushed under the weight of authority misused. And now, here she was, caught in its grasp. She adjusted her grip on the grocery bags, her fingers curling around the thin plastic. No. The single word cut through the air like a blade. A ripple passed through the small crowd gathering around them. Boone's expression hardened. You're resisting? He asked, his voice lower now, edged with something sharp. Abigail held her ground. I am not resisting. I am standing. Boone exhaled sharply, shaking his head. He stepped closer, his voice dropping just for her to hear. You really want to do this out here? In front of all these people? Abigail didn't flinch. I think that's exactly where this needs to happen. The tension snapped like a wire pulled too tight. Boone reached for her wrist. And the moment his fingers closed around her arm, she knew he wasn't trying to de-escalate. He was trying to dominate. The grip was firm, rougher than necessary. Her grocery bag slipped from her fingers, hitting the pavement with a dull thud. Apples tumbled across the sidewalk. A can of beans rolled into the gutter. A half-gallon of milk burst open, white liquid spreading across the concrete like a crime scene. But Abigail wasn't looking at that. She was looking at Boone, at the way his fingers dug into her skin, at the flicker of satisfaction in his smirk. She could hear the murmurs in the crowd, the phones now fully raised, recording every second. And then, the moment that changed everything. Boone's grip tightened. He jerked her arm, hard. A gasp rippled through the crowd. You're hurting me. It should have ended there. But it didn't. Because instead of letting go, Boone did something no one, not Abigail, not the growing crowd, not even the bystanders who had seen police overreach before, was expecting. He swung. Not a shove. Not a warning. A full force, rage-filled punch. The kind that cracked ribs. The kind that was meant to hurt. The kind that was never meant for a woman of God. For a moment, everything froze. The impact sent Abigail crashing onto the pavement. The back of her head snapped back. Pain exploded through her body. And for a brief, terrifying second she couldn't breathe. She tasted blood, warm, metallic, thick on her tongue. Her cross, the one she had worn every single day for over 40 years, snapped from her neck and landed beside her. Broken clean in half. And for one suffocating moment there was nothing. No movement. No sound. Just the shocking reality of what had just happened. Then, chaos. What the hell? Did you just punch a nun? Somebody stop him. The crowd erupted. Voices crashed together in a storm of outrage. People surged forward, their phones capturing everything. Faces twisted in disbelief, anger, horror. Boone took a step back. His chest rose and fell, his breath uneven. And in that flickering instant his expression shifted. From arrogance to something else. Fear, because he had just crossed a line. And he knew it. For a split second, there was nothing but stunned silence. The kind that sinks into your bones. The kind that stretches time, making a single moment feel like an eternity. Then chaos. You hit a nun. What the hell is wrong with you? Somebody stop him. The street exploded with noise. People surged forward, their voices no longer whispers but roars of fury. The kind that shakes the ground beneath you. The kind that carries the weight of generations of injustice. Sister Abigail Monroe lay on the pavement, her vision swimming, the coppery taste of blood lingering on her tongue. Pain radiated from her cheek, sharp and pulsing, but she wasn't focused on that. She was focused on the man standing over her. Officer Travis Boone. His chest heaved. His fists clenched at his sides. His stance the wide-legged, ready for a fight posture of a man who had just realized he'd gone too far was rigid. His mirrored sunglasses had been knocked askew in the scuffle, revealing his eyes. And in them, for the first time, was something Abigail had never expected to see. Fear. Because he knew. He had lost control. And now, the world was watching. Phones were raised in every direction, their screens capturing every second, every shaky breath, every drop of spilled milk seeping into the concrete like evidence at a crime scene. A woman in a blue dress had her phone practically in Boone's face. "Oh, you're done. You are so done." A man in a baseball cap stepped closer, his voice thick with barely restrained rage. "That's assault on a nun. You think that badge is saving you now?" Boone's nostrils flared. His mind raced. He was a cop. He had been in situations before where things got out of hand. But this? This was different. This was him at the center of it. He reached for his radio, pressing the button hard. His voice came out tight, controlled. "Dispatch, this is Officer Boone. I need immediate backup at..." "They're not coming." The voice cut through the air like a blade. The crowd turned. And there, standing just a few feet away, was Sergeant Daniel Carter. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't shouting. He didn't need to. Because the way he looked at Boone, the way his eyes burned with something cold and immovable was enough. "Put your hands on your head, officer." The world seemed to tilt. Boone blinked, his brain scrambling to catch up. "You're serious?" Carter's expression didn't waver. "You just assaulted a 63-year-old nun. On camera. While in uniform." He took a step forward, his tone turning razor sharp. "You're lucky I don't cuff you myself." Boone opened his mouth, then shut it. His pulse hammered in his ears. He could feel the crowd shifting, closing in, their voices thick with rage. This wasn't just a bad situation. This was career-ending. He gritted his teeth. "I was just what?" Carter's voice sliced through the tension. "Just doing your job? Just abusing your power? Just making sure everyone here knows exactly who the hell you think you are?" Boone's fingers twitched at his side. His mind raced for a way out. A way to regain control. But then he saw it. A woman in the front row of the crowd, still filming, turned her phone just enough for the screen to be visible. Breaking. Brookhaven police open internal investigation into Officer Travis Boone. Boone's breath hitched. The words glowed like a death sentence. Carter tilted his head toward the crowd. "They saw the footage, Boone." His voice dropped slightly, deliberate. "They know what you did." A step closer. "And guess what?" Boone swallowed hard. "They're not protecting you." Another step. "They're cutting you loose." The words landed hard. Like a judge's gavel slamming down. The air around them had shifted. This wasn't the crowd Boone was used to, the kind that backed away, afraid to interfere. No, these people were different. They weren't watching this happen. They were making sure it would never be forgotten. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Lock him up." Another voice joined in, then another, and then like a wave crashing down the chant began. "Lock him up! Lock him up!" Boone's jaw clenched. His hands curled into fists. He could feel it now, the power slipping away. The authority he had carried so effortlessly for years, dissolving like smoke in the wind. He turned slightly, scanning the perimeter, looking for an escape, for an ally. But the other cops weren't moving to stop Carter. They weren't coming to help Boone. They were just watching. Like they had already made their decision. Like they knew this was bigger than one man. And Boone? Boone was alone. He took a step back. His breath came short and ragged. His mind spun through 100 different escape routes. But none of them led to safety. Not this time. Because this time, justice wasn't waiting. It was coming for him. For the first time in his career, Officer Travis Boone felt something he wasn't used to. Powerlessness. The chants echoed in his ears. "Lock. HIMUP." The words struck him harder than any punch ever could. The heat of the moment burned against his skin, sweat forming at his temples as his breath came in short, ragged bursts. He had spent years controlling situations like this, making sure people knew who held the authority. But now, standing in the middle of a street filled with fury, he wasn't the enforcer anymore. He was the hunted. Sergeant Daniel Carter took another step forward, his badge glinting in the sunlight. "Turn around, Boone. Hands behind your back." Boone's fingers twitched at his sides. His body was still wired to react, to assert control, to push back. But there was no power left for him to wield, no fear left for him to command. The moment his name hit the news ticker, he had become a liability. His department had already made its decision. They weren't coming for him. They were coming after him. The weight of it all hit him like a freight train. And then, he ran. It was pure instinct. A jolt of survival twisting through his gut. His boots slammed against the pavement as he shoved past a man holding his phone up, nearly knocking him over. "He's running." The words ripped through the crowd like wildfire. People gasped, shouted, pointed. Someone tried to grab his arm, but Boone yanked free, his breath ragged as he sprinted toward the nearest alley. His mind screamed at him to think, to find a plan, but there was no time for planning, only escaping. Behind him, Carter's voice was sharp and unforgiving. "Unit 12 to dispatch. Suspect is fleeing on foot. Lock down all exits, he's not leaving this city." The radio crackled with confirmation. Boone barely registered it. He needed to disappear. His lungs burned as he tore down the alleyway, weaving between dumpsters and abandoned shopping carts. He shed his police jacket mid-run, tossing it aside like dead weight. His badge followed, hitting the pavement with a metallic clink. If he could just make it a few more blocks. If he could just, sirens. Loud, close, his pulse spiked. He skidded around a corner, nearly losing his footing. Up ahead, squad cars screeched into position, blocking off the intersection. No. Boone's breath came in short gasps as he pivoted, darting into a narrow side street. His hands clawed at his belt, his brain screaming for a weapon, for anything to give him the upper hand. But there was nothing. No badge. No gun. No authority. Only the weight of his mistakes dragging behind him like an anchor. He heard footsteps pounding behind him. Fast. Gaining. "You can't outrun this, Boone." Carter's voice was steady, relentless. Boone's muscles screamed as he pushed harder, his vision blurring at the edges. The alley spat him out onto another street, this one lined with old brick buildings and storefronts. People turned, startled by the sight of a uniformed officer sprinting like a desperate man with nowhere left to go. Because that's exactly what he was. "He's done. They've got him surrounded." The words rang out from somewhere in the crowd. Boone's eyes darted wildly, scanning for an opening, an escape. But everywhere he looked, there were more people, more cameras, more judgment, more truth. His chest heaved. His legs burned. Then disaster. A curb. His foot caught. Time slowed. He crashed forward, his body slamming into the pavement, his palms scraping against rough asphalt. His chin struck the ground, the impact rattling through his skull. And before he could even think about getting up, boots. Heavy. Close. Surrounding him. "Stay down." Carter's voice cut through the noise, sharp and unwavering. Boone's mind screamed at him to move, to fight, to do something. But when he tried to push himself up, a knee pressed between his shoulder blades, pinning him down. Cold steel snapped around his wrists. Thoughts click. "Travis Boone, you are under arrest for assaulting an unarmed civilian and fleeing law enforcement." Boone let out a strangled breath, his face still pressed against the pavement. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had spent his entire career making sure this didn't happen to him. He squeezed his eyes shut. He could still hear the crowd, their voices rising in furious triumph. He could still hear the sirens. And worst of all, he could still hear the sound of his own downfall, echoing louder than anything else. By the time Travis Boone was hauled into the back of a police cruiser, the world had already changed. The footage had spread like wildfire. Within minutes, social media platforms were flooded with videos of the incident. The punch. The fall. The moment a police officer lost control in broad daylight and struck a 63-year-old nun. Captured from every angle. Replayed over and over again. People didn't just see it. They felt it. The rage. The disbelief. The sheer, unfiltered horror of watching someone sworn to protect turn into the very thing the badge was supposed to stand against. Brookhaven's local news stations were the first to break the story. Unbelievable scenes today in Brookhaven, as Officer Travis Boone was caught on camera striking Sister Abigail Monroe, yes, a nun, before attempting to flee the scene. The footage is already sparking outrage across the country. Then came the national headlines. Brookhaven officer caught on camera assaulting elderly nun. Public outcry grows. Justice for Sister Abigail. Protesters demand action against police brutality. Is this the breaking point? America reacts to shocking video of Officer Boone's attack. Cable news anchors interrupted their usual segments. Networks lined up experts, former police officials, legal analysts. Everyone had something to say. This isn't just a case of excessive force. This is an outright criminal assault. There is no defense for what we just saw. How does someone in uniform believe they can get away with this? The answer is because for too long, they have. If that nun hadn't been Sister Abigail Monroe, a well-respected community leader, with decades of service, would the outrage be the same? Would justice even be considered? By the time the evening news rolled around, Brookhaven was unrecognizable. Hundreds had gathered outside the police department, their voices rising in chants that could be heard across town. Justice for Abigail. Signs were raised, fists clenched, candles lit as the sun dipped below the horizon. The mayor held an emergency press conference, flanked by the police chief, their faces drawn and tense. What happened today is unacceptable. We are launching a full investigation into Officer Boone's actions, and we will cooperate fully with the judicial system. Empty words. The crowd knew it. Because this wasn't about an investigation. The world had already seen the evidence. There was no spinning this. Inside the police station, Boone sat in an interrogation room, his hands cuffed to the table, his face pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. The walls weren't thick enough to block out the sound of the protests outside. He could hear them. The anger, the fury, the demand for something the system had never given out freely. Justice. His lawyer sat across from him, his fingers steepled, his expression unreadable. Boone's mouth was dry, his mind racing for some way to fix this. "They're making a spectacle out of this," he muttered. "They're acting like I." His lawyer held up a hand. "Stop talking." Boone blinked. "Do you know how many calls I've gotten in the last 2 hours?" His lawyer's voice was low, even. "None." Boone frowned. "No one is coming to save you," his lawyer continued. "Not the department. Not the union. Not the people you used to drink with after your shift. You know why?" Silence. The lawyer leaned forward. "Because they already saw the footage. And they know what you don't." Boone swallowed hard. "This isn't about whether you're guilty." His lawyer's lips pressed into a thin line. "It's about how fast they can get rid of you." The weight of those words settled like a stone in Boone's chest. Because he knew deep down, in a place he didn't want to admit, his lawyer was right. This wasn't just a bad situation. This was the end of everything. As the night stretched on, the country continued to react. Brookhaven was on fire, not literally, but it might as well have been. The streets were flooded with people, their chants growing louder, their presence impossible to ignore. Abigail, still recovering from the attack, had refused hospital admission. She remained at the shelter, surrounded by supporters, her face bruised but her spirit unshaken. She had spent a lifetime fighting for the forgotten. Now, the world was fighting for her. By morning, the governor had issued a statement. The Department of Justice announced a federal inquiry. Civil rights organizations mobilized. The pressure was mounting, and the system was finally starting to crack under its weight. And somewhere, in the darkness of his holding cell, Travis Boone realized there was no coming back from this. Because this time, the truth wasn't just spoken. It was broadcasted for the whole world to see. The courtroom was packed. Every seat was filled, every aisle lined with spectators, and every media outlet had their cameras rolling. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that pressed down on everyone in the room like the weight of history itself. Brookhaven's courthouse had seen its fair share of trials, but nothing like this. Nothing that had drawn in national news, civil rights activists, and everyday people who had never set foot in a courtroom before, but knew this was different. This wasn't just a trial. This was a reckoning. At the front of the room, Travis Boone sat at the defendant's table, his once pristine uniform replaced with a dull gray jumpsuit. The arrogance he had once carried so effortlessly was gone, stripped away by the weight of the evidence against him. His hands rested in his lap, cuffed together, though the real shackles, the ones no one could see, were the ones tightening around his future. Across from him, seated with quiet dignity, was Sister Abigail Monroe. The bruises on her face had faded but were still visible, a reminder of why they were all here. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her expression calm, unwavering. She had nothing to prove. The evidence had already spoken for her. At exactly 9 o.m., the bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise. Court is now in session." Everyone stood as Judge Malcolm Greer entered, his presence commanding instant silence. A man known for his no-nonsense approach to justice, Greer wasted no time. "We will proceed directly to opening arguments." The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Elaine Chambers, rose from her seat. She was direct, methodical, and carried the weight of the public's demand for justice on her shoulders. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what we have before us is not a case of misunderstanding. This is not a case of an officer making a mistake. This is a case of unchecked power, of a man who believed he was above the law, and of a woman who became his victim simply for standing her ground." She let the words settle. "The evidence is clear. Multiple videos, from multiple angles, showing Officer Boone assaulting an unarmed, elderly woman in broad daylight. The entire country has seen what happened. Now, it's time to hold him accountable." Boone's lawyer shifted uncomfortably. There was no defense to be made, not really. No loopholes, no technicalities. Just a desperate attempt to lessen the inevitable. But when he stood, his voice was hollow, his words thin. "My client deeply regrets what happened that day. He—" "Objection, Your Honor." Chambers' voice cut through. "Regret is not a defense against violence." Sustained. Boone's lawyer sighed, rubbing his temples. He had represented police officers before, had gotten plenty of them off on lesser charges, had twisted just enough reasonable doubt to secure a reduced sentence. But not this time. There was no spinning the truth everyone had seen with their own eyes. The trial moved quickly. The video evidence was played again and again, from different angles, different perspectives, each showing the same horrifying reality. The witnesses testified. The man who had been standing by the ATM, who had seen the whole thing unfold. The woman in the blue dress, who had screamed at Boone as she filmed. The dozens of others who had been there that day, who had watched in shock as a sworn officer of the law threw a full-force punch at a defenseless nun. And then Sister Abigail herself took the stand. The courtroom fell completely silent as she walked forward, steady and unshaken. She sat down, folded her hands in front of her, and when the prosecutor asked if she was ready, she simply nodded. "Sister Monroe, could you please tell the court what happened on the day of July 14th? Her voice was calm, clear. "I was on my way back to the shelter. I stopped to help a boy who needed money for his insulin. That was when Officer Boone confronted me." "And what happened next?" Abigail met Boone's gaze across the courtroom. "He accused the boy of being a criminal. He accused me of being naive. And then, when I refused to let him intimidate me, he attacked." Her words rang through the courtroom, undeniable, unshakable. The prosecutor nodded. "And did you do anything to provoke this attack?" "No," Abigail said simply. The defense lawyer cleared his throat. He hesitated before speaking, as if he knew there was no point. But still, he tried. "Sister Monroe, wouldn't you say Officer Boone was simply trying to maintain control of the situation?" She tilted her head slightly. "Is that what you call it? Maintaining control?" Her voice was quiet, but it landed like a hammer. Boone shifted in his seat. The trial continued, but the verdict had already been decided long before the jury was dismissed to deliberate. They were gone for less than an hour. When they returned, the courtroom braced itself. The judge looked over the jury, then turned to the foreperson. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." "How do you find the defendant?" The room felt like it was holding its breath. "On the charge of aggravated assault against an unarmed civilian." A pause. "Then, we find the defendant guilty." A ripple ran through the crowd. "On the charge of obstruction of justice." "Guilty." "On the charge of fleeing law enforcement." "Guilty." Boone's shoulders slumped. His mouth opened slightly, as if he was about to speak, but there was nothing left to say. The judge adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable. "Travis Boone, you have been found guilty on all counts." Given the overwhelming evidence and the severity of your actions, this court sentences you to a pause. Then, 350 years in federal prison. The silence shattered. The crowd exploded. Applause. Cheers. Some people sobbed, their hands covering their mouths in relief. Boone's face was ashen, his fingers twitching uselessly against the cuffs. He wasn't walking out of this courtroom a free man. He wasn't walking out of this century a free man. This was his final moment as anything other than a prisoner. And Sister Abigail? She closed her eyes, took a deep, steady breath, and whispered to herself, "Justice has prevailed." The world moved on. But Travis Boone didn't. Locked inside a cold, gray prison cell, he sat on the thin mattress, staring at the cracked ceiling. The sound of the prison gates clanking shut had long since faded, but it echoed in his mind over and over again. 350 years. It might as well have been a death sentence. For decades, he had believed himself untouchable. He had worn his badge like armor, used it as a weapon, never questioning whether the system that protected him would one day turn against him. But now, here he was forgotten, discarded, rotting away in a place where his name meant nothing. Outside, the world had changed. Brookhaven was no longer the same town where he had once ruled the streets. The police department, desperate to repair its shattered reputation, had purged officers with excessive force complaints. The mayor had announced sweeping reforms, including mandatory body cameras, independent oversight, and de-escalation training. The protests had stopped, but the movement hadn't. And at the center of it all, Sister Abigail Monroe. Her face had become a symbol. It wasn't just on TV screens anymore. It was everywhere. Murals painted on brick walls in cities across the country. Portraits of her standing tall, her gaze steady, a quiet strength radiating from her presence. Some depicted the moment she had risen from the pavement, blood on her lip but fire in her eyes. Others simply showed her holding her broken cross in her hands, a reminder of the day she refused to bow to injustice. And then, there was the banner. The massive black and white image of her, draped down the front of Brookhaven City Hall, illuminated by floodlights at night. Beneath it, in bold, unwavering letters, "When one person stands for the truth, they can change the world." People stopped in the streets to take pictures. Some left flowers at the base. Others simply stood in silence, letting the weight of it sink in. But Abigail herself? She hadn't changed. She still walked the same streets, carrying bags of groceries to the shelter. Still tended to the people society tried to forget. Still met every challenge with the same quiet resilience she always had. She had never wanted to be a symbol. But sometimes, history chooses its own heroes. One morning, she sat at the shelter's small wooden table, sorting through the letters that had poured in from across the country. Some were from activists, thanking her for her strength. Others were from mothers, fathers, people who had lost loved ones to injustice but had never seen consequences until now. And then, there were the children's letters. Simple words scrawled in crayon. "Sister Abigail, you are my hero. Because of you, I want to help people." She ran her fingers over the words, pausing for a moment before folding the letters carefully. Justice had been served. But the fight wasn't over. It never was. She took a deep breath, then stood, smoothing out her modest dress as she looked toward the doorway. The world had changed, and she wasn't done yet. In a world where injustice often goes unchecked, Sister Abigail Monroe reminds us that one voice, one act of courage, can spark change. She never sought to be a symbol, she simply stood for what was right. And because she did, the world had to listen. For many, this story is not just about a corrupt officer facing consequences, it's about the power of truth, the resilience of community, and the undeniable impact of standing firm in the face of wrongdoing. Too often, we are told that one person can't make a difference, that systems are too big, too ingrained to change. But history has proven otherwise. For older generations who have witnessed decades of struggle, this is a reminder that the fight is never over. Justice isn't inevitable, it is fought for, demanded, and upheld by those who refuse to stay silent. No matter your age, no matter your role in society, your voice matters. Injustice thrives on silence. But when one person stands for the truth, they can change the world, and that change starts with us. Justice is not just a concept, it's a responsibility we all share. Sister Abigail's courage reminds us that standing up for what is right can leave a lasting impact. The world may not change overnight, but every act of truth brings us closer. If this story moved you, leave a like and subscribe to join us in sharing powerful stories of resilience, justice, and hope.